Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ask Me Anything About Elections. We're going to get started, and I will hand it over to Edison Research Senior VP, Tom Webster.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks everyone for choosing to spend for some of you, your lunch hour. For some of you, maybe it's coffee, with us as we talk a little bit about this year's election cycle and answer your questions about politics, polling, exit polling, and some of the things that we do here at Edison. For many of you who may have attended some of our previous webinars this summer, we've certainly done a lot on things like audio and podcasting and things like that. But we also have this other job that keeps many of us busy. And that is as the sole provider of both exit polling and vote count data for the news networks that make up the national election pool. So on significant primaries or this coming election night, if you're watching the news on TV and you're watching coverage of the election and you're watching exit polling data, that's actually coming from us, vote count data as well. And this year is very consequential and a lot of sort of interesting wrinkles. And so we wanted to kind of answer some questions and talk a little bit about what some of those wrinkles are. And our intent here is certainly not to get partisan about anything, but really to talk about the process. So when you ask questions and encourage you to do so, please do so in that spirit. Questions should go in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, because the chat box is for chat. But if they're in the Q&A box, we will definitely see them. And so I want to kick things off. There's a number of Edisonians here. Those that you can see include Joe Lenski and Meyn, and they work 25 hours a day on some of our election processes. And Mary, I want to start with you. We used to have places that we could go to in the world. We no longer have places. How has that changed the kind of process of things like exit polling? I think a lot of people may not necessarily know the process of exit polling. And of course, that's going to be a little bit different this year. So maybe talk a little bit about how it was done in the time before and how we're going to be doing it this year and what we've kind of learned.
Sure. So I'd be happy to talk about how we conduct our exit polls on Election Day. So we do in-person interviews with voters as they leave individual polling locations on Election Day. So in the general election, we have thousands of interviewers at randomly selected locations throughout the country where we're actually, voters are going inside that building, they're casting their ballot, and then as they exit, our interviewer is there representing Edison Research and the news organizations that you mentioned, asking voters if they would like to participate in a short survey about who they voted for and what issues were important to them on that day. So as you said, the world is quite different, or will be quite different in November as it was compared to November of 2018, for example, or even during the primary elections in February and early March before COVID. In-person voting and in-person exit polling didn't have to have these COVID considerations, and people were going and voting in person at polling locations. But in 2020, we in the general election will need to consider that the world is different. And as you said, people are not going out in the same manner that they were before. People certainly still are going out. Plenty of people will still vote in person on Election Day. And so Edison Research will still be there at polling locations throughout the country on Election Day talking to real voters as they exit the polling locations. With that said, we have always conducted telephone surveys of people who vote absentee or by mail. And so that's always been a component of what we have done in terms of representing voters in our surveys. And so we're going to continue to do that. It may just be a larger portion of the electorate might be voting absentee this year. And in addition, we do, many people now vote early in person. So in many states, you can actually go before Election Day and cast your ballot just as you would on Election Day. And we will actually be interviewing people in person with our exit poll methodology in that manner as well. So certainly, maybe people are not going out as much as they were before, but there will still be voters on Election Day, and there will still be in-person exit polls on Election Day.
So that's a little bit on how the process is going to be different. Joe, how is this election going to be different? When we look at the election in 2016 and how that played out, how do you think things are going to play out this year? I'm not obviously asking you to pick a winner here, but again, in terms of what the election looks like this year, how is it going to be different from 2016?
Well, Mary touched on the process is going to be different in terms of voting for a lot of people. We've seen in the elections we've covered, the primary elections we've covered in April, May, June, July, and early August so far, that a much larger percentage of voters are casting their ballots by mail. So while that may have been about a quarter of the electorate in 2016, it's probably going to be closer to half the voters are going to choose to vote by mail or absentee. We expect probably another 30 to 40% to vote in person on election day, and another 10 to 20% to vote early in person at early voting centers in the states that provide that. So just the fact that people will be voting earlier means that many more votes will have been cast before November 3rd than on November 3rd, which means the campaign itself has to start earlier, and convincing people to vote and be part of the process is going to take place even earlier than previous elections.
We got a question in from Amy Abrams. Welcome back to a frequent attendee of our webinars. Love to have you back. And she's asking, what are the best ways to reach the younger voter 18 to 34? Many campaigns probably spend too much on TV to reach this less likely to vote audience. So how do we really get their attention? That's a thorny one, Joe.
Yeah, and it's different too this year because usually November 3rd falls in the middle of college semester, and active students can recruit other active students to participate in voting on campus. That's going to be limited in a lot of campuses around the country. So I think the campaigns are looking at different ways. There's going to be less door-to-door. There's going to be less big events on college campuses. And the campaigns themselves are going to have to look at different ways to activate candidates. And we'll see how much that affects turnout among 18 to 34 voters. That's typically the group that turns out at the lowest rate in normal times, and we'll have to see if the campaigns are able to activate those voters in these abnormal times.
Yeah, and just one thing too that I wish we would see more of, I think, is kind of influencer marketing about voting. Obviously we've had celebrity endorsements for years, but not necessarily TikTok influencers and Instagram influencers actually attempting to make the process cool, or if not cool, imperative, I think, to a younger audience. So that's certainly one way. But following on to that, this is a question that was sent in by Derek Gibson, who I think is on here today. Hi, Derek. And it's really about how you mentioned students not being in college. I'm also not at work, and you're not most of us are at home. So he asked, how do you believe the shift in the workforce to working from home has influenced your pre-election polling? Assuming polling is done online and phone, do you find people being more available to complete polls? Is that positively or negatively impacting your ability to get accurate polls? And I'll throw that open to Mary and Joe. What do we think? I mean, we've certainly been doing a ton of testing.
Yeah, and Mary can talk about more of the testing we've done in terms of the exit poll process on election night. But in terms of the surveys that we've done, both online and telephone, and I've talked to a lot of other people that are conducting telephone and online surveys shortly after March, when people were even more at home than they are now, there was an increase in response rates in telephone and online surveys. That seems to have leveled off. But I think being at home actually makes potential respondents more available. And I think with all that's going on right now, not just the election, but COVID and the economy and all the other issues going on right now, I think there is an increased awareness of what's going on, an increased need to follow what's going on, and I think increased need among respondents to make their opinions known. So I think for at least the short term, response rates have gone up, and that's made the job of asking people their opinions a little easier.
And just a follow-up on that, because I know Derek would ask this, I'm sure, because I know Derek. Is there with the character of people voting early and voting absentee versus the character of people who will actually show up on election day and vote on that day, is there a lean there? Is there a bias there to that?
Yeah, we're seeing bigger differences between by-mail voters and election day voters than we've ever seen before. I mean, I've been doing this since 1988. My first job was CBS election survey unit covering the Dukakis Bush the Elder presidential election in 1988. And there, by-mail voting or early voting was just a small oddity that maybe 5, 10, 15% of voters did, and it was concentrated in only a few states. Now, with more than 50% of voters in many of these recent primaries voting by mail, we're seeing differences, huge differences in how they're voting from how voters on election day are voting. And I think a lot of this is being driven by the rhetoric out there, especially the president's rhetoric, encouraging his voters to vote on election day and trying to discourage participation by mail, or at least put the by-mail process under some sort of question. So we've seen elections recently. There was a recent special election in New York, CD 27 for an open house seat there. That's upstate New York near Buffalo, where the election night reporting showed the Republican winning by more than 30% because New York was only counting their election day ballots on election night. And then a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, when the by-mail ballots were being processed, that margin narrowed in the final certified vote to almost 5%. So you saw big changes between when the election day vote was counted and the by-mail vote was counted. And we're looking on election day to be very careful when we see the early returns to make sure we understand, are those election day votes, or those by-mail votes, or what combination it is, and when these other ballots are going to be counted, because we're going to see big swings based on how people choose to vote on election day. And we've been seeing that in the pre-election polling as well. A majority of Biden supporters right now, and most of the polling I've seen, say they plan to vote by mail, while a much larger majority of Trump supporters right now say they plan to vote on election day. Now, we'll see if those plans remain when November 3rd gets closer. But as of now, we're going to see bigger differences between how by-mail voters are voting and how election day voters are voting than we've ever seen before.
So just as you started answering that, Edward Keene asked pretty much the exact question, but there's a little kicker at the end, which I want to get at and maybe throw this to Mary. Edward asked, one recent public opinion poll has suggested that there will be a rather sharp partisan split among Democrats and Republicans regarding which voters intend to vote by mail and which voters intend to vote in person. To what extent is your firm adjusting your process to account for this possibility? Joe, I think you've addressed that. And will that provide potential distortions in how the initial exit polls are reporting? Which leads me to ask, tell us about early exit polls.
Well, I was going to jump in, and thank you for that question. I was going to jump in even on what Joe was saying, just to talk a little bit, just to expand a little bit about what it means to have the more of the vote by mail and what it means for election return. So Joe talked about the partisan divide between those who vote on election day and then those who vote by mail, and he used that example of the CD 27 in New York State, how on election night, the Republican was ahead by 38 points, and that's the election day vote. And then it weeks later. So what I want to emphasize is the weeks later part. The final election results were known, and the Republican did indeed win, but he won by 5 points. And the reason I want to emphasize that is the by-mail voting component means that the election results take longer to count, and they take longer for the county vote offices to process. And it also means in many places, those votes, it varies by state when those votes need to be in their office. But if they're postmarked by election day, then as long as they're received by a week later or something like that, then they are still counted. So there will actually be ballots being counted well after election day. And it may take time for us to know in various races, particularly in these places where absentee ballots are allowed to be counted after election day, as long as they're received with a postmark, it's going to take some time for those results to be known. But just getting back to your question, Tom, sorry to jump on a different topic. In terms of early exit poll returns, no exit poll information is made public until or no projections are made public or which way the race is going until the polls close in any particular state. So while analysts are looking at the results as they come in throughout the day, it's a very small portion of very small number of people who Joe is looking at those results and a very few others at the networks, but those numbers are not available to the public so that it will not sway anyone's vote. And no information about which way the race is going will be made public until after the polls close in any given state.
And another point here is when we release results, exit poll results to the news organizations and they start talking about it shortly before the polls close and after the polls close, we are including the results from our telephone surveys of by-mail voters. We're including results of our in-person interviews of early voters, and we're including our in-person interviews of election day voters up to that point. So we have voters from all the different methods of voting included in any data we release. We may be adjusting throughout the day and throughout the evening the proportion of those voters as we learn more and more what percent of people are voting by mail, what percent of people are voting on election day. And as we start seeing results by those different modes, we'll again adjust. But any exit poll data that's released is going to include interviews of all types of voters, by mail voters, early voters, and election day voters.
Yeah, and just to reiterate something, because I get asked this all the time. If it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon on election day and someone's tweeting about that they have exit poll data, no, they don't.
Yeah, I mean, everything is embargoed to a very small group of people at each network until 5 p.m. Eastern, and that's when you'll see CBS and CNN and NBC and ABC start talking about exit poll results at that time, but they will not release any data that characterizes the outcome of the race. That's a pledge the networks have made over the decades to Congress to say that they will not release any exit poll data that characterizes the outcome of a race until all polls in that state have closed.
So here's a question sent in from Kelly Johnson. We've taken to extending great things, right? American Idol went to a 2-night finale. I think The Voice now goes to a 4-night finale. How many nights will the finale of election night be? And will it be election week? Will it be election month? When's it going to end?
Well, there's 2 ways to answer that question. One is there's always been a week's, or in some cases month-long process to count all the ballots and certify those results in every state. So that process always takes days and weeks, and those final results are usually not known until late November or early December in most states. But what the news organizations provide are unofficial results, the partial returns that are made public by county election officials on election night or shortly thereafter, and we use that information to project winners based on statistical models, based on historical outcomes of these races. So people think the election is over on election night in most cases, even though the counting historically is going on longer. And as Mary has pointed out, because of the dramatic increase in by-mail voting this year, that process is going to take election officials and vote counters even longer. So the question is basically, Tom, will we know the outcome of the presidential race and most of the other races on election night? And we don't know that yet. There will be plenty of individual races that will not be called on election night, but there'll still be states that will count their votes quickly. There are states that have processes to count large number of by-mail votes because they've been doing it for decades. I would say to people that want to know if you're going to know on election day or shortly thereafter who's going to win the presidential race, I would look at states like Florida and North Carolina that have historically had a lot of early voting or by-mail voting and have processes in place to report those votes pretty quickly. If we know the outcome is clearly in one direction or another in Florida or North Carolina, even if other states are taking longer to process, and I'm looking at states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania that historically have had low number of by mail or early voting, but were swamped in their primaries this year by a large increase of early voting and took a long time to process those votes. We still will be able to get some indications from the states that are processing quickly what the overall outcome is. So I know a lot of people are talking about this taking weeks or months. The actual vote count process will take weeks or months, but it'll tend to depend on the margin of victory, how quickly we know on election night, and whether the states that will be counting quickly give us enough of an indication that we know election night, or are they close enough that it's going to be an indicator that it's going to take days or weeks to know the overall winner.
And just a real quick follow-up on that. This was sent in by someone earlier. Why can't we just start counting now? I mean, there's a lot of votes in.
Well, different states have different rules on this, and a lot of states have been changing these rules on the fly, both for the primaries and both for the general election. And Mary can probably go through because her team of election researchers are keeping track of all these changes. Some states do allow the processing of by-mail balloting before election day, not necessarily the counting. No votes are counted before election day, but the actual processing, the checking of signatures, the checking of addresses, make sure that no one has voted twice, to make sure that no one that voted by mail can vote on election day. All that processing in some states is done on election day, but some states don't allow that processing to happen until the morning of election day itself, and some states don't even allow that processing until all the polls have closed. So that's why you have this variability in state to state about how quickly early voting or by mail ballots can be processed and reported. So I think, Tom, you're going to start seeing some states change their rules to allow this processing earlier, but it's still going to vary dramatically state to state, which states will be processing these by mail ballots faster than other states.
So here's a question. I'm going to throw this to you, Mary, and this is I'm going to combine two questions from two different people, sort of a value meal, if you will. Scott Musgrave wrote in, there's been a lot of talk about voter suppression in some states in the form of fewer voting locations. Is that something you're seeing as you plan your exit polling this year? And then Chris Penn wrote in, where'd he go here? Chris Penn wrote in a question about what role do we play, or does exit polling play in certifying that the election was conducted fairly? So I'm going to combine those. Mary, you want to take a crack at some aspect of that? Sure.
So every election, there's a number of polling locations that's determined typically by the county, and it's going to fluctuate. It fluctuates every year. And certainly we've seen this year through the primaries, there have been some instances in some states where they've decided to have fewer polling locations due to not having the same number of poll workers, or just other scenarios that require them or enable them in certain cases to have fewer polling locations. So that is a normal part of the election process to have, to fluctuate the number of polling locations. It's not unusual for that to happen. But certainly this year there could be, as we've seen in some of the primaries, there could be significantly fewer polling locations in some areas where COVID is limiting the amount of staff or limiting the number of locations in which people can vote. So we saw that in the Georgia primary. We saw that in the Wisconsin primary, which was in early April, shortly after COVID really came to a head in the spring. So we may see something like that, and that's not unusual. Although at times we see that it significantly lengthens the time it takes to vote. So that's a concern, certainly. But I'll let Joe talk about, how the exit poll stands, in terms of certifying our election results.
Right. Again, as I said earlier, we just report results, vote results that county and state officials provide us. It's the county and state officials' job to certify these votes. What we will have from both our interviews of by-mail voters, our early interviews of early voters, and our election day interviews is a measurement of how many people are voting by each of those methods and what their demographics are and what their breakdown is. So we will be comparing those results to what is provided by the state, but they're not a precise validator of certified results. We can have, all these methods we have margins of error and will not provide a precise validation. That's up to the state officials in their certification process, and when their races are close enough, their recount processes to certify those votes.
So another question we were sent in, and I'm going to, again, sort of combine a couple of questions here. Do you predict any potential surprises? We're going to have a surprise third-party candidate. And related to that, how many votes will Kanye West get?
Well, there's not going to be a lot of places where people are going to be able to vote for Kanye West. He didn't announce officially until July 4th, and by then, nearly half the states had their candidate filing deadlines pass. And his campaign is not particularly efficient about even making it on the ballot in the states where he's trying to get on the ballot. Here in New Jersey, his signature petitions were so flawed that they were kicked out, and his lawyers didn't even challenge that verdict. So he won't be on the ballot here in New Jersey. In fact, he won't be in the ballot for sure in states that make up more than half of the vote in the Electoral College. So I don't think people are going to have the opportunity to vote for Kanye West in a lot of places. And as of right now, it doesn't seem like very many of the major battleground states that are going to be close are going to have a Kanye West option on the ballot. So I'm going to take the under on Kanye's vote total. And I'm going to guess it's going to end up being well under 1% when all said and done, just because of the availability of people to be able to vote for him. And again, those candidate filing deadlines have passed in most states for all candidates. So at this point, launching a third-party campaign is not practical and not doable. And none of the candidates that are currently on the ballot, I think, are getting the coverage or making the impression that even candidates like Gary Johnson, the Libertarian nominee last time, or Jill Stein, the Green Party nominee last time, made. And even combined third-party vote in 2016 was only about 6% of the total vote. I'm expecting, based on the pre-election polling and based on the candidates on the ballot, the third-party vote will be even less than that nationwide, maybe at most 2, maybe 3% max. I think it's going to be much lower than it was in 2016.
Way to crush my dreams, Joe.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to ask a question here. Actually, Edward Keene just sent in a question, and it's related to another one that was sent to us earlier. If a greater percentage of voters would choose to vote by mail this year, what is the relative response rate to telephone interviews versus the in-person interviews? In other words, is your ability to get a representative sample more challenging through phone interviews versus in-person interviews? And I'm going to sandwich that with another question that was sent in. In 2016, there were some entities that were fairly wrong about predictions, which has led to a belief that somehow polling was affected in 2016, and how has that been corrected for? So, Joe, what's your perspective on all that, and what are the differences between in-person sampling and telephone sampling?
Well, one of the reasons we still do most of our interviews in person is we do get a much higher response rate in our in-person interviews. We've typically, over the years and even this year, get typically 40 to 50% average response rates for our in-person interviewing. And Mary can talk about some of the procedures we've tested in June and July that even in the COVID environment, as long as our interviewers are properly prepared with masks and sanitizer and stay more than 6 feet away from voters, we can still get the same rate of participation response rate on election day. Telephone interviews have a much lower response rate, but this is true of all telephone interviews. Typical single-digit response rates. If you're getting 5 to 9% response rate on a telephone survey, you're actually doing pretty good. But even with all that, we have still seen ways to make telephone surveys, even with those lower response rates, are still representative of the population as large, and especially representative of voters, since voters themselves, people that are likely to participate in an election, are also those, coincidentally, that are more likely to respond to telephone surveys. So So that's, we're dealing with telephone survey response rates the same way any pre-election survey is dealing with telephone response rates. As for the accuracy of polling in 2016, the polling in 2016 actually overall was about as accurate on average as previous presidential elections. It was just in the handful of states like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin that were critical to the electoral college outcome. The polling in those particular states were not as accurate as the other states. Part of that was a late break in voters, which we measured in the exit poll. Those that decided late in 2016 were much more likely to choose Trump over Clinton, especially in states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. So some of that may have been errors in the polling, but a lot of it was just missing people that chose late, undecided voters that chose late to support Trump. And that group was mostly, as we identified in the exit poll, people that had an unfavorable, voters that had an unfavorable opinion of both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. But that group in the end, when push came to shove and pushed in their mind the lever for the lesser two evils by about a 17-point margin, those people that disliked both Trump and Hillary Clinton chose Trump, and that was the deciding factor in those states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. We're seeing a slightly different dynamic in the pre-election polling in 2020. One, there's actually a smaller group of voters that are negative to both Trump and Biden. Biden's unfavorable ratings are much lower than Hillary Clinton's were 4 years ago, and even Trump's unfavorable numbers are not higher than they were as a candidate in 2016. He seemed to solidify at least his base supporters as well. So that group is going to be smaller, the group that's unfavorably disposed to both Trump and Biden. And based on the pre-election polling right now, that group is much more likely to say they're going to support Biden as a change agent in 2020. And that typically is what happens with that group. That group that dislikes both candidates tends to lean towards change. And in 2016, the change agent was Donald Trump. In 2020, Trump as the incumbent is not the agent of change that he was 4 years ago.
We're past a half an hour here, but we're still getting some questions in. So if you got questions, get them in now, and we'll try to get them before we wrap up. Amy Abrams just asked another question. I was actually just about to ask this question because it came from someone else as well, because it's a thing I've been hearing people say about lying voters. And Amy asked, from 2016 polling, did you find any truth to the secret Trump voter? If yes, do you anticipate a similar response this time? Do people lie to pollsters to make it look like he is polling weaker than he really is? And I have to say, this is a question I have gotten multiple times. This theory that there's some cabal of people actively lying on polls to trick us, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, there is no evidence that people lie in polls. There is some evidence that the response rates by different groups vary based on the events going on. There's some evidence that when your candidate is doing better, your supporters are a little more likely to respond to polls. When your candidate's not doing as well, you're a little less likely to respond to polls. But those are response rate issues, and we have ways of dealing in weighting with different levels of response, either by age or by education or by partisanship. But there's really no evidence that people take the time to sit through a survey in order to lie to us. People are much more likely to hang up the phone if they don't want to participate than to take the time to actually participate in the survey and lie to distort our data. There's no evidence I see that people are doing.
Yeah. So I don't see any more questions coming in. I'm going to ask this to both of you, to Mary first, because we know there's all kinds of quirky stories and behind the scenes things that happen during the whole exit polling process in various precincts, and every precinct is different, and a big part of our exit polling effort on election day is just a massive coordination effort of thousands of people basically doing this entire exit polling process. Mary, any anecdotes or anything quirky that you can share about the joy of election night and exit polling?
I mean, truly, you actually see my big smile because this is something that is close to my heart because we have the opportunity to talk to people all over the country. And we do, our interviewers are all over the country, and then our interviewers go and speak to voters all over the country. And so we truly do speak to people in rural Alaska and, and urban Baltimore and all over the place. So in terms of quirky stories, we hear about the New Hampshire primary. Of course, it was in February. It's very cold. It's dark. We have a vote reporter there who's going to send us the final results of the election once the town has completed the count. And it's just our reporter and the town clerk there. And they had food ordered in for anyone who might come in. So, but not very many people came. They weren't expecting many people, but even fewer came because it was cold and dark. And so our reporter and the town clerk enjoyed their dinner together, and as the team at the office there processed the votes. And we hear stories like that all the time. Our interviewers going into a polling location to speak with the officials before they conduct their exit poll. And there being donuts and coffee that are for the poll workers that they offer to share with our exit pollster, or just, stories that voters tell our interviewers that get passed on to us. So really interesting, just all walks of life, citizens of our country casting their vote and us having the opportunity to report the opinions that people have.
Yeah, one thing real quick before, Joe, before I get your story. I'm in marketing, and people are always asking me or telling me I would never take an exit poll. I would never take an exit poll. But you said it earlier, Joe. The response rate for an exit poll is between 40 and 50%, which if you're in direct mail marketing or something like that, like you can't. Those are mind-boggling numbers. But anyway, Joe, what's something funny that you recall from your life as a pollster?
Well, I don't know if it's funny, but I just want to point out that even before COVID, our first event this year was the Iowa Democratic Caucus, and the Iowa Democratic Party had trouble reporting results the night of the caucus even before COVID hit. So the theme of this year has been for us from the very beginning, starting February 3rd in Iowa, sitting around waiting for results to be tabulated, waiting for results to be available for us. And I think that is a fitting theme that we'll see on November 3rd. It won't be every place. It won't be all over the country. Some election officials will be able to process ballots very quickly and will be able to report results on election night. But part of the process of reporting results this year has to be informing viewers, consumers of these results, what is possible to be reported that night and what is not going to be possible to be reported tonight, and which results are near completion and which results are nowhere near completion. So when you're looking at results on election night, look not just at what the candidates are getting at that point, but listen to what votes have not been counted and how those results can change once the rest of the votes are processed, whether it's later that night, days later, or in some cases weeks later this year.
So I want to thank everyone for joining us on a Friday. We typically do these on a Thursday, but we had to do it on a Friday because of election work, as it turned out. And I want to talk about what the next in our series is going to be, which we are going to go back to Thursday. So it's in 2 weeks from yesterday. We will be having another webinar, and this one's going to be a bit of an update on podcasting share of ear and how that has potentially changed during quarantine. We're sitting on just mountains of great data, both from our podcast consumer tracker and also from our share of ear series. And so I'm going to be giving just a quick 15 to 20 minute sort of catch up on podcasting's role in that and how pandemic and quarantine and working and doing everything from home has influenced podcast listening. So I hope you'll join for that. Registration details will be on our website. That again will be on Thursday, August 27th. And for everyone that participated in this and spent part of your lunch/coffee hour with us, I'm going to give you 18 minutes of that back. And thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.